So Bayern Munich are currently known as the Rekordmeister, as they've won the Bundesliga the most times, currently 34, soon to be 35. However, until the Munich side took over the name in the 80s, it was another Bavarian side that were nicknamed the Rekordmeister. Now, the fact that I just called the team from Franconia Bavarian could cause a couple of issues, but it's Nuremberg. So Nuremberg were founded in 1901, and the 20s is really known as a golden era, as they would win 5 German football championships in that decade. They were a free-scoring team, and so, for example, in 18 games, they scored 115 goals and only conceded 6 in 1919. And so their first title came in 1920 when they beat fellow Franconian side Fürth, so the team that would later become Greuther Fürth today. They beat them 2-0 in the final. They would repeat the feat a year later, beating Vorwärts Berlin 5-0 in Düsseldorf. They nearly won the title 3 times in a row, reaching the final again a year later. However, against Hamburg in the championship game, it would be abandoned, and this was due to Die Club, which translates as the club, as in the stature that Nuremberg had developed. They didn't have enough players due to red cards and injuries. Hamburg would be awarded the title by the DFB, however, because of sportsmanship, etc., they declined. 2 years later, there would be a repeat of this final, and this time Nuremberg actually came out top and won with a 2-0 win against Hamburg. In 1925, they would win again, beating Frankfurt in the final 1-0, and their final title of the decade came in 1927 when they overcame Hertha Berlin 2-0. Then, after a period of transition, Nuremberg would win 3 major trophies during the Third Reich: 1 German championship and 2 Schammer Pokals, DFB Pokal equivalent, and that included the first edition of the new cup competition in 1935. However, Nuremberg have, again, like most German teams, have a bit of a testy relationship with the war and the success, because obviously Nuremberg was kind of like the epicenter for the emergence of the Nazi party in the late 20s and then in the 30s. I mean, the Max Morlock Stadion, right by it, is the parade ground which the Nazis used to host their rallies. The massive theatre hall that's just across the lake from the stadium was built by the Nazis, and they had grand plans to make Nuremberg a major city. I mean, there's a massive straight road near the stadium, and that was also built by the Nazis. So it does show a bit of a problem that Nuremberg has. And again, it also impacted the club in ways too. Strange thing I'm about to say. The only positive from the war period was one of Nuremberg's most important ever players emerged, and that was Max Morlock. So he was born in Nuremberg, and then he's a striker, and he made his debut for the club in 1941 as a 16-year-old. And he was then even called up to the national team at 17 by Sepp Herberger. However, when he turned 18, he was obviously conscripted into the military, but he was stationed nearby in Schweinfurt, which means he could continue playing for Nuremberg during the war. However, at the end of the war, Morlock would be captured by the Americans, and he would spend 5 months as a prisoner of war before returning to Nuremberg. So he was captured in May and would return at September. But then upon his return, he obviously was now entering his prime as a footballer, and he played a key role in leading Nuremberg to the German Football Championship title in 1948. He scored 30 goals in 34 games. And this was a team which was primarily filled with players like him, and that is local players. Then the club would go through another rebuilding period, and Morlock would again continue to be a protagonist in this, and he would then also go on to be a key player for Germany in the 1954 World Cup win. Then, with another young team, they would win the German Football Championship once again in 1961, beating Borussia Dortmund 3-0 in the final, and then a year later they would go on to win the DFB Pokal. And the media called this one of like the crowning moments of Morlock's career. He was approaching the end of his career. Obviously, a lot of players at his age at this time would have retired, but he was still playing, and he played a major role in leading this young team to these titles. And because of Nuremberg's success over the years, it meant they, with the table that would determine the qualification for the Bundesliga when it came into effect in the 60s, Nuremberg were top. And so obviously they ultimately qualified for the league. However, there were people in the club sceptical because it meant professionalism, which means you have to pay people properly. Then in the first season of the Bundesliga, Nuremberg would finish 9th, and Max Morlock would play his final season for the club. And he actually had postponed his retirement just so he could play in the Bundesliga. He actually scored the club's first ever goal in the Bundesliga too, on the opening day, and obviously he's retired, and now the stadium in Nuremberg is named after him. In 1968, they would actually go on to win their most recent league title, and they're currently their first and only ever Bundesliga, as they finished 3 points clear of Werder Bremen. However, things would go from very good to very bad for Nuremberg very quickly. The following season, they would be relegated from the Bundesliga as champions, and that's a feat that no one has been able to match since. With the blame was all basically put on title-winning head coach Max Merkel, as he attempted to shake up the team after the title win, keep people on their toes, and it went poorly. The team would then spend 9 years in the second division. Then even when they did get promoted back to the Bundesliga, they would spend most of the time hanging around the bottom half of the table before dropping down again, back up and whatever. And so changes were made at the top, and in came Gerd Schmelzer as the president, and he would form a partnership with the head coach at the time by the name of Heinz Hoher. Hoher had made his name as head coach of Bochum and would prove to be quite a character, as well as a bit of a trailblazer too, with how he played and trained. So when the club was relegated, Hoher opted to use this as an opportunity to give younger players a chance, and this upset some of the older players, as well as the way Hoher wanted to play football, who had been at the club for a while. Ultimately, there was a mutiny from these elderly players, but the board backed Hoher, and ultimately how they addressed the mutiny was just getting rid of most of the players who had been a part of it. And so this was the dismissal of senior players such as Udo Horstmann. And so over the time period, with names such as Stefan Reuter and goalkeeper Andreas Köpke, the club would not only return to the top flight, but they would even qualify for Europe after a 5th place finish in 1988. However, since then it has been more or less up and down for Nuremberg. They've struggled financially, especially in the 90s and 2000s, and have had to sell key players at different intervals to help them continue to operate, because obviously they were used to being a Bundesliga team, then they got relegated, then you have to deal with it, and as we've seen, especially in the 90s, most of these teams can't deal with it. And so they were basically in constant limbo for most of the time since that time in the 90s. However, in 2007 there was a bit of a bright spot as they finished 6th in the league and also went on to win the DFB Pokal, beating Stuttgart, who had won the title in that season in the final. However, in 2014 the club would be relegated again to the Zweite Bundesliga, and this obviously saw a mass exodus of players, which helped them to a degree. But then basically since then they've been blocked in the second division. In the just 11 years since they've were relegated, they've only spent 1 year in the Bundesliga. So they spent the other 10 in the Zweite Bundesliga, and even came close to relegation 1 year, having to play the relegation playoff in the COVID season. And they've had plenty of players pass through: Guido Burgstaller, Niklas Füllkrug. And then after kind of like this, when they nearly got relegated, they kind of begun to change things. First, Dieter Hecking became sporting director. He did initially become coach too. And the kind of start of this new look Nuremberg happened with the sale of Robin Hack, who moved to Arminia Bielefeld. And what this was they've become a bit more smart in the transfer market. And then obviously, what happened was they began to use their academy as well as become smarter in the transfer market. So that started with Hack, who moved to Arminia Bielefeld for 1.2 million. And then when they were getting smarter was the likes of Jens Kastrop, who moved from the second team in Cologne. Then they promoted the likes of Nathaniel Brown, Can Uzun from their academy. And slowly but surely these players would become key players for Nuremberg. And then what they did was they would build up these players and then they would sell them. So Can Uzun, Jens Kastrop, Nathaniel Brown and Finn Jeltsch all joined from the academy, or in Kastrop's case, Cologne's, played a key role for Nuremberg and then were sold on to a Bundesliga side. Brown moved for 3 million and was the first to leave. Can Uzun then left for Eintracht Frankfurt for 11 million, while Finn Jeltsch moved to Stuttgart for 9.5 million. And then Kastrop would ultimately leave last summer to Borussia Mönchengladbach for 4.5 million. They also plucked Kasper Jander from Duisburg after they got relegated and his contract was no longer valid in the fourth tier. So he joined and then was ultimately sold to Southampton for 12 million. And kind of like their magnus opus so far has been Stefan Zimas. So Zimas joined Nuremberg on loan originally from PAOK with an option to buy, but the option to buy was worth 18 million, which was a ridiculous amount of money for the club the size of Nuremberg to be paying. But they waited until they found someone that was interested in Zimas, and that was Brighton. And so Nuremberg basically smashed this Zweite Bundesliga transfer record to buy Zimas for 18 million, and then they sold him to Brighton immediately afterwards for 26.5 million. So they made £8.5 million profit, which in itself is a lot of money for Nuremberg. In return, obviously the head coach is now Miroslav Klose, so he could give wisdom on how to be a striker to the likes of Zimas. And they struggled initially in the Bundesliga this season, or in the Zweite Bundesliga. They were flirting with relegation, but they persisted with Klose. They're currently 9th. They're obviously not going to get promoted. But now they're being used as a team that could potentially offer first-team football to younger players. So Tag Buchmann, who's had a hard time with injuries, joined on loan from Bayern Munich. Berke Yilmaz, who is a defender for Freiburg, joined on loan. Javier Fernandez joined from Bayern. And then obviously they've started to work on being a bit more smarter in the transfer market again as they look to sell on players again. But most importantly, and obviously now the problem that Nuremberg have found themselves in, is working like this is kind of a bit like drugs. You buy all these players young and you sell them high and you're making all this money, but then you kind of defeat the point of being a football club. And the fact is, that Nuremberg should be in the Bundesliga, but they're obviously not. So something needs to be done to address that. So they have to find the right balance instead of just basically becoming the Eintracht Frankfurt of the Zweite Bundesliga. But obviously whether Nuremberg have, because obviously, for example, with the generation of Uzun, Zimas, Brown, whatever, obviously a very talented generation, and potentially you can make the argument that they may have missed the opportunity to make a shot at promotion with this generation and then sell them afterwards. But instead they've done it this way, and now it's how can they mastermind using this money to not only be able to still make a large profit, but also push for the Bundesliga because of how long they have been in the second division. But yeah, it's the story of Nuremberg and how they went from Rekordmeister to bang average Zweite Bundesliga side, but obviously they're turning a corner now. So let me know what you think about Nuremberg, or if there's anything that I may have missed in this video.